Over the past 3 years now, I've been exclusively writing all of my GitHub Actions in Python. So normally people write them in TypeScript because it's natively supported in GitHub Actions, but I decided to start using Python. And it turns out that you can write them in pretty much any language. So for those who are not familiar with GitHub Actions, it is an automation and CI solution provided by GitHub. This allows you to pretty much create workflows for each of your different tasks that you need. So for example, if somebody pushes code to one of your branches or an issue is created, you may want to run automation on top of that. And these actions are built up in different steps, and you can use different components from different users and organizations to achieve the tasks that you need. A good example is the code that you can see on screen. That is a YAML configuration file that defines 3 useful steps. The first one being a checkout, so checking out my code. The second one being actually setting up my Python to a specific version that I want. And the last one is a custom action that I want to use, and that's what we'll be working on today. So let's start coding by creating a new folder called Python action, or whatever the name of your action is or your repository. You can either clone it from GitHub or create a local Git repository. I'm going to create one right here using Git init. This will just create me a Git repository. I then want to then quickly edit and create a file called action.yml. So what this is doing is just creating a YAML file for us. The second thing I want to do is now start filling in this YAML file with my configuration. So let's go ahead and do that now. So we've created a basic template for our actions YAML file. You can see here the name and description are set to my action. So this can be set to whatever your name of your action is. You can see up here now we're running it as a composite action. So we're set it to composite. Composite actions require a number of steps to be applied. So you can see here we have a step that is using the shell and run. So this is setting it to bash, and it is running these 2 commands. So this export command, which we'll get to in a bit, and this Python module loading command. Let's also set up some inputs for our GitHub action. What this has now done for us is add 2 inputs, one called repository and another called token. By default, these actually take environment variables called GitHub repository and GitHub token respectively, but the ability for an end user to actually be able to update this so they can add a with repository and then point it to a separate repository, or use another token for the GitHub action is extremely powerful. Now let's add these as input to our Python script. What this is now doing is providing arguments to our Python module. So let's go ahead and create that Python module now. As a quick side note, you can actually just call a single script as well by replacing this -m my action above to actually specifically to that path of your Python script. So let's now go and quit NeoVim in this particular case. Let's create a quick directory called my action. Let's also create a my action init file. So for those who are not aware of this, we'll actually just create a module file for you. You can just set the name to something like my action. I just do this for simplicity. But one of the quick side notes is that now what we can do is we can create this my action underscore main.py. And what this actual file is that when a module is arbitrarily called with that python-m your module, it'll actually under the hood call this file as like your main in other languages. So if we did here a quick print line of hello world, you'll actually find that if you now run this module, and it will print hello world as we can see here. Now let's update this Python script to do something useful in our action. Now what this code does is actually parses the arguments provided by the GitHub Actions or via a CLI call, and then actually just print out one argument in our case, which is the GitHub repository. So you can see here where you could actually have some different workflows, maybe take in some different variables to really help like automate certain tasks. GitHub instance if you're using GitHub Enterprise Server, or it might be other things as well, such as settings you want to bring into the application. One of the other things you may want to look into is logging out to Actions as well. Actions has a specific standard of how they output to the console, so you can get pretty printing of error messages and debug messages in Actions. If you take a look at the GitHub Action docs, you'll actually see exactly what I mean. If you take a look at how you output commands or write debug messages or export warnings to your end users, you can find it all here. One of the most important elements that we need to talk about now is actually how to install dependencies. So this is actually can be done two ways. The first being dynamically installing at runtime, or the second is what we call vendoring dependencies. Dynamic dependencies is actually done when you're executing the action, it will install the dependencies for you. And vendoring the dependencies is actually where you store all of the dependencies that you need into your repository. The benefit of vendoring dependencies is actually that if you're in restricted environments where actions are run, you don't need to dynamically install all of the dependencies you need, and they're actually inside your codebase already, so you don't need to depend on anything external. And what you'll find is all of the JavaScript and TypeScript actions today have to do this in some form or another, where they store their dependencies inside a lib folder or something like this. And if you're using TypeScript, you do have to transpile it into native JavaScript to actually run it in Actions, because under the hood, Actions is using Node for these types of actions. So I highly recommend vendoring those dependencies just to make your life a little bit easier. So what we need to do is use a mkdir to create a new folder called vendor. The second thing we need to do is actually run whatever package manager we want. So in my case, I actually want to use pipenv for most of my package management. This will actually create a bunch of virtual environments, install the dependencies we need inside that virtual environment for a specific version, etc. But it actually isn't inside our vendored folder right now. So to get pipenv to actually output into that vendor directory, we actually need to call the pip command. So if we run pipenv run pip freeze and pipe that output to our requirements.txt, what this will do now is create a file called requirements.txt, and it actually looks the exact same as what you use if you're using pip. So now for both pip and pipenv, it's the exact same command. We want to run pip install -requirements.txt, so similar to any other time you use pip, but the only difference is we're going to add this --target vendor to point to the folder that we want to vendor our dependencies into. And once we run this, what we'll actually do is it will install all of those dependencies inside of our vendor directory. So if we take a quick look inside our vendor directory here, we can actually see there's a distribution of all of the packages that we need. One thing you can do is actually remove these dis-info folders as well, as they're not needed. You can actually use this rm-rf command to actually do this for you. And this will actually remove all of those dependencies that we don't need. So if we go back to the actions.yml file now, we actually have this line here that we didn't explain earlier. And actually what this is allowing us to do is that when we run this Python command, we're actually supplying two values to the Python path. The first is actually the location of the action itself, separated with a colon, and actually the location of the vendored path, which is also inside the action. This allows Python to know exactly where your current module is, so my action, and also know where all of the modules that you've installed, such as requests and everything that it depends on as well. So now let's actually add all of our files to our Git repository using a git add command, and then let's add a quick git commit with maybe a helpful message saying initial action. For example, let's save. And now what we can do is actually push this to a remote repository. So the last step to create a GitHub action, once you've pushed it to a remote repository, is actually to create a release for it. Now you can click on the actions YAML file to create a public one, but I'm actually just going to create a quick release. I'm going to select a new tag called maybe something like v1, for example, as my tag, pin it to my main branch, credit that. I'm not going to push it to an action to the actions marketplace. This actually requires a unique name so that other actions don't use the same names. And then you can also create your release notes as you do with normal releases. And once you're ready, you can publish a release. Once you've created a release now, people can actually pin it to those specific releases or to your main branch. Finally, we can see our action in action, where we can set the owner and the repository with the specific tag. In our case, we're actually setting it to v1, but you can also set it to a particular branch, so maybe main, or you can also set it to a commit char as well to pin it to the exact commit that you want to refer to as well. And actually, if you go now into the action logs, you can see that this is run, And you can see it's run our action, and you can see here it's actually just printing out the repository exactly like our action was intended to. And that's it. That's how we can create a Python-based GitHub Actions without any JavaScript or TypeScript needed to be written. All of the code you can find under my username in GitHub. I've also provided an actions template for you so you can automatically clone it if you're going to go ahead and create your own actions in Python. And if you want to see anything new, please feel free to comment it down in the comment section below, and feel free to like and subscribe. Thank you so much. Hope you have a lovely day.